Boy dies after snake bite, returns with a terrifying vision of humanity's end. The sun had just begun its descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Ben, only 13, was walking along the familiar path that led to the edge of the woods near his home. It was a peaceful evening, the kind that should have been filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustling of the trees. But today, there was a strange, unshakable tension in the air. The birds were silent, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ben had been told not to wander off too far into the forest, but he was always drawn to the mysterious woods, the places where adventure waited just beyond the treeline. He wasn't afraid, not of the creatures, not of the shadows, and certainly not of the dark. He wasn't one of those kids who stayed inside playing video games when the world outside was so much more intriguing. But as he walked, something caught his attention. It was a flicker of movement, a flash of scales among the underbrush. Ben's eyes darted toward the sound, but he didn't stop. Just a snake, he thought, shrugging it off as though it were no different from the squirrels and rabbits that lived in the forest. What he didn't notice was the way the air had suddenly changed. It grew still. The trees seemed to lean closer, as if watching, waiting. Then came the strike, a flash of motion so quick, Ben had no time to react. The pain was instantaneous. It hit him like a jolt of electricity, sharp and searing in his ankle. Ben stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat as the world tilted. His eyes darted down, seeing the black and yellow patterns of the snake's skin just before it slithered away into the leaves, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing sensation of numbness creeping up his leg. Ben's heart raced. He tried to steady himself, but his legs gave way, sending him crashing to the ground. Panic surged as he reached for his phone, but his hands trembled too much to unlock it. His vision blurred. His thoughts grew slow, heavy. Every breath became more labored, as if the very air was turning thick and suffocating. The venom is spreading, Ben realized with horror, his brain fighting to stay clear as his body began to shut down. He tried to scream for help, but the words wouldn't come out. His throat closed up, constricting like the snake's fangs had done to his body. The last thing he saw before his world went black was the sun disappearing behind the horizon, the world now darkening around him like the slow encroachment of an inevitable end. Ben woke up, or at least he thought he had. The world he found himself in was unlike anything he had ever seen. There were no trees, no familiar landmarks of home, no soft ground beneath his feet. Instead, he was standing in the middle of a vast, open expanse, an emptiness that stretched in every direction. There were no stars in the sky, no moon, just a dark void that seemed to swallow everything. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence. There was nothing, no sound, no motion, just an endless void. But then he heard something, a whisper, so faint it seemed to be carried on the wind, or perhaps it came from inside his head. He strained to listen, but the words were unintelligible. Confusion flooded him. Was he dead? Had he really died out there in the forest? The thought was overwhelming, but as he tried to move, his body obeyed, slowly, heavily, as though it was not quite his anymore. He stumbled forward, unsure of where to go. There were no landmarks, no path to follow, just the empty darkness surrounding him. Suddenly, the world around him shifted. He blinked, and the void was gone, replaced by an endless field of decayed remnants. A barren land stretched before him, covered in cracked earth and skeletal remains. But what was most disturbing was the sense of decay in the air, a putrid, choking stench that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the place. The sky above him was not the bright blue he had known. It was gray, clouded, as if the very atmosphere itself was sick with some unseen plague. Ben's heart raced. He wasn't alone. Far in the distance, he could see shadows moving, figures stumbling aimlessly. Their forms were distorted, blurred, as though they were not quite solid, not quite real. The closer he got to them, the more he could see, humans but not. They walked with empty eyes, heads hung low, as if they were merely husks of the people they once were. They didn't acknowledge him, didn't even seem to know he was there. Ben's body stiffened in terror. What is this place? He wanted to run, but his legs refused to obey. He could feel the weight of their hollow gazes on him, the presence of something ancient and malicious behind them. But the figures didn't reach out for him, didn't make a sound. They simply wandered, like forgotten souls trapped in this desolate world. And then, through the mist of his confusion, a voice, low and grave, spoke to him. "You've seen the truth now, child," it said. The voice was neither kind nor threatening, but neutral, almost lifeless in its delivery. "You are not meant to be here. You were meant to witness." But witnessing is only the beginning. Ben tried to speak, to ask what it meant, but no words came. The voice wasn't just in his ears, it was inside him, echoing in his thoughts, filling his very soul. "This is what awaits humanity," the voice continued. "This is the price of their recklessness, their sins. This is the end of the road for all who refuse to listen, to change. They walk towards oblivion, and soon, they will be nothing." The sky darkened further, and the air grew colder. The figures in the distance shifted, their movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. Ben's heart beat faster, his fear rising as the ominous words lingered in the air. "What do you want me to do?" he whispered, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, the figures began to draw closer to him, their faces now clear, twisted, distorted in pain, like they had been ripped from the very fabric of reality. Their mouths opened in silent screams, but there was no sound. They reached for him, their hands thin and skeletal, fingers twitching. Ben's body jerked back, but his legs remained frozen. The horror of the vision before him consumed him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. His thoughts scattered, his mind reeling from the weight of what he was witnessing. Was this a warning? Was this humanity's fate? Was this why he had been sent back? Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, a violent shake that threw him to the ground. He landed with a thud, the world spinning around him as the figures advanced. The air grew thick with the sound of their silent screams, the darkness pressing in from every side. In that moment, Ben understood. This was not just a dream. This was not just a vision. This was a glimpse of the end of humanity, the end of everything. And there was no escape. Ben's pulse thundered in his ears, his body trembling with fear as the images around him shifted once more. The figures in the distance had become clearer, their faces filled with despair, their hollow eyes fixed on him as if he were the only thing that could fill the void. But what struck him the most wasn't the hopelessness etched on their faces, it was the chilling silence. The world around him was void of sound, yet it was anything but peaceful. The air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere had absorbed the weight of all the suffering that had been lived and died before him. He tried to look away, tried to focus on something, anything else, but his vision wouldn't let him. The figures were drawing closer, like a tidal wave of the broken and the lost, stretching toward him in slow, agonizing steps. They moved in an eerie, uncoordinated fashion, as though the very essence of their being had been fractured, leaving only remnants of what they once were. Their bodies, thin and frail, staggered forward, each one locked in a hollow, silent scream. Ben's breath caught in his throat as one of the figures reached out toward him, a skeletal hand brushing the air just inches from his face. The sensation of their touch was not physical. No, it was something far more unnerving. It was the sensation of cold despair that flooded his chest, pulling him into the emptiness they carried with them. He wanted to run, to turn away, but his legs refused to move. His body felt paralyzed, caught in the grip of something far worse than fear. This is it. This is what they warned me about. Ben's mind raced, but the message was clear. This was a vision, a prophecy, a glimpse of a future that was too terrible to comprehend. These were the souls of those who had ignored the warnings, the cries, the desperate pleas for change. And now, they wandered in an eternal prison of their own making. The figure closest to him turned its head slowly, its eyes locking onto his with a soulless gaze. There was no recognition, no hint of humanity left in those eyes, only an endless void. Ben could feel his heart beating faster, his pulse pounding in his throat. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he struggled to process the vision before him. "They don't know what's coming," the voice echoed in his mind again, its tone as cold as the empty space surrounding him. It wasn't just a voice, it was the voice of humanity's guilt, the weight of their collective sins pressing in on him, suffocating him with every breath. "You've seen the truth now, child," the voice continued, its words piercing the silence that seemed to hold everything in place. "Humanity's time is running out. You are the one who will carry the warning. You are the last hope." The words sent a shiver down Ben's spine, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of the message. He wanted to shout, to scream that this couldn't be true, but his voice failed him. He wanted to ask questions, wanted to understand why he had been chosen, why he was the one who had been brought back to see this. But the answer was clear. The reason didn't matter. All that mattered was what he had seen and what he was now meant to do. The air around him seemed to hum with an electric charge, the tension building with each passing second. Ben could feel the weight of the vision pressing on him, sinking deep into his chest. He could feel the heavy burden of this knowledge, this horrifying truth that would change everything. But what could he do with it? What was he supposed to do now, when the whole world seemed to be spiraling into a future of pain and suffering? "Tell them," the voice commanded, its words sharp and final. "Tell them what you have seen. You are the last messenger. You are the one who will carry the truth and make them see." Ben's heart raced as the meaning of the words slowly began to sink in. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He wasn't just someone who had witnessed something horrific. No, he was now a part of it. He was the one who had been chosen to carry this message to those who still lived, to those who still had time to change, to those who could still be saved. The figures continued to close in around him, their hollow eyes fixed on him as though they were waiting for something. But what were they waiting for? Were they waiting for him to speak, to share the truth with the world, to give them some sense of redemption for their suffering? Ben shook his head, his thoughts spinning. He had no answers. He had no plan. He was just a boy who had been taken too soon, who had witnessed a terrible truth. But as much as he wanted to run, as much as he wanted to escape, he couldn't. He had been given this knowledge for a reason. The world was heading toward an end that could still be stopped, if only people knew the truth. He felt a pull, a tug on his chest, like an invisible hand was leading him forward, urging him to move, to act. His legs finally obeyed, carrying him forward through the sea of lost souls. Each one reached for him, their eyes wide with desperation, their silent cries filling the empty air. Ben's heart clenched as he realized the gravity of the vision. These people, these souls, they were the consequences of a humanity that had failed. They were the product of a world that had ignored its own destruction, too blind, too arrogant to see the signs. And now, they were trapped in this endless void, this purgatory of their own making. As he moved deeper into the vision, the weight of the truth pressed harder against his chest. It wasn't just a prophecy, it was a warning that humanity had reached the precipice, and if they didn't change, if they didn't listen, they too would become part of this endless procession of lost souls. Ben reached the center of the vision, where the dark figure had been standing. The figure was still there, but now it was no longer just a silhouette. Its face was visible now, and the hollow eyes stared at him, unblinking, unmoving. There was no malice in the figure, no cruelty, only an undeniable sense of inevitability. "You will carry the message, boy," the figure said, its voice resonating deep within Ben's bones. "You will speak the truth, and the world will listen. But it will come at a cost." Ben's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the fear rising in him again. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against Ben's shoulder. And in that moment, everything around him shifted again. The air grew heavy, the light dimmed, and the shadows seemed to encircle him. "The end is near," the figure said one last time. "And only you can stop it?" Ben stood motionless in the center of the vision, his mind reeling from the weight of the words. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. He was the messenger, the one chosen to bear a truth too terrifying to grasp, yet too important to ignore. The figure before him stood silent, its gaze unwavering, its presence overwhelming. Ben wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, caught between two worlds, the one he had left behind, and the one he had been thrust into, a world that seemed to be unraveling before his very eyes. What do you mean? Ben finally whispered, his voice trembling. What am I supposed to do with this? How can I make them listen? The figure's hollow eyes blinked slowly, as if considering his question. The world is already on the edge, it said softly, its voice like the echo of a distant, forgotten dream. You have seen the truth. You have witnessed the consequences of their actions, the ripple of their choices that will carry them into oblivion. Now you must make them see. You must make them understand. Ben's heart pounded harder in his chest. He felt sick, like his stomach had been twisted in knots. He had no idea how he was supposed to make anyone understand. He was just a kid, a boy who had been killed by a snake bite, who had returned with a vision that could change everything. But how could he change anything? He had no power. He had no authority. He didn't even know where to begin. I'm just a kid, Ben murmured, his voice barely audible, almost to himself. I don't know how to fix the world. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, its skeletal form gliding effortlessly over the barren earth, its movement unsettling in its fluidity. It's not about fixing the world, the figure said, its voice growing colder. It's about showing them what they've become. What they're becoming. They don't realize it, but they are already lost. They've made their choice, and now they must face the consequences. Ben swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. It was too much to comprehend. What does this have to do with me? He wondered, his thoughts scattered like broken glass. Why was I chosen to bear this message? The world around him seemed to warp and twist again, the shadows elongating, the air thickening with an unseen pressure. Ben's breath quickened. The vision was changing again, shifting like a living, breathing thing. He could feel it, an unease, a sense of dread that surged through him like an electric shock. The landscape around him began to change. The barren field, once a place of twisted souls, was now crumbling, disintegrating under an invisible force. The sky above him, once a heavy shade of gray, turned black, like ink spilling over an untouched page. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling, the cracks spreading wide, exposing the raw, empty void beneath. The ground trembled beneath his feet, the earth splitting apart as though the entire world was collapsing. They can't stop it, the voice said again, the figure's form beginning to distort and blur, like the edges of a fading memory. The end is coming for them, whether they are ready or not. But you will be the one to see it through. You will carry the truth that can still save them if it is not too late. Ben's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. What truth? What can I do with this truth? He cried out, frustration bubbling in his chest. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't make sense of what was happening to him, of what he was supposed to do. He was just a kid, a boy who had been killed, who had been given a glimpse of a fate he didn't want to believe. The figure's gaze softened, though its expression remained unreadable. The truth is simple, it said, its voice now a whisper in the air. Humanity is on the brink of destruction. They don't see it, don't know it yet, but they are the architects of their own downfall. Their greed, their selfishness, their disregard for life, all of it is leading them to this point. You were shown the end. Now you must show them. The ground shook again, and Ben staggered, his balance failing as the tremors reverberated through the air. The walls of the space around him seemed to collapse in on themselves, but the figure was still there, standing firm in the center of the chaos, its presence unwavering. What do you want me to do? Ben gasped, his chest tight, his vision swimming. I can't stop this. I'm just a kid. The figure's silence was deafening, but then, just as Ben was about to lose himself in the despair of it all, the figure stepped forward. Its skeletal hand reached out and placed a cold, unyielding grip on his shoulder. The touch was not painful, but it felt like ice spreading through his body, freezing him in place. You must find them, the figure whispered, its voice now almost unbearably soft. You must make them see the truth. And in doing so, you will unlock the door to their salvation. If they refuse, if they turn away, then they will face what is coming. Ben stared at the figure, his body rigid with a combination of fear and confusion. But how? He choked out. How do I even begin to make them see? How can they hear me when they can't even hear themselves? The figure's eyes met his, and for a moment, Ben thought he saw something resembling pity, or perhaps even sorrow. The words that came next were the final, undeniable truth. You are the one who will make them listen. You have seen what they will become if they don't change. Now you will speak the words that will bring them to the edge of their own salvation. But you must act quickly. Time is running out. And then, with those words, the figure began to fade into the darkness, its form dissolving into the void from which it had emerged. The air around Ben grew heavier, and the ground beneath him felt unstable, as if it too would soon crumble into nothing. Tara's voice, faint but clear in his mind, echoed once again. Tell them, Ben. You are the last one who can. The end will come unless they understand. And with that, Ben was left alone in the dark, standing at the precipice of a world on the edge of oblivion, uncertain of where to go next, but knowing, deep in his soul, that there was no turning back. Ben felt the pressure of the world closing in around him. His breath, shallow and quick, was the only sound in the dark void. The message that had been given to him, the warning about humanity's inevitable destruction, was like a weight on his chest, suffocating him with its urgency. But now, standing at the precipice of this terrifying truth, he didn't know what to do next. How could he speak to people about something they couldn't even comprehend? How could he make them see the end that was coming? The landscape around him had shifted once again. The barren field where the shadows had wandered was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of empty roads that seemed to twist and turn, disappearing into the horizon. There was no clear direction, no clear path. Just endless stretches of road that all led to nowhere. He took a hesitant step forward, the sense of being watched growing with every footfall. The ground beneath him felt soft, almost like quicksand, as though it was trying to swallow him whole. But he pushed forward anyway. There was no other choice. The voices in his head, the whispers of the lost souls he had seen, were growing louder now, their silent screams reverberating in his ears. The world had become a blur of gray, with no color, no hope, just an overwhelming sense of impending doom. As he walked, the air grew colder, and the sky above him darkened even further. The weight of the vision, of the knowledge of what was to come, was pressing down on him. His legs ached from the journey, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. Suddenly he stumbled. His foot caught on something, a rock, a root, or maybe just the shifting earth itself, and he fell hard to the ground. His hands scraped the dirt as he tried to catch himself, but the impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping for breath. His body trembled, not just from the fall, but from the intensity of the fear and confusion that gripped him. As he lay there, struggling to regain his bearings, a low hum filled the air, vibrating beneath the ground, like a heartbeat pulsing through the earth itself. Ben's eyes widened as he realized that the hum wasn't just in his head, it was real, and it was growing louder. The ground beneath him shook again, but this time, it wasn't just an isolated tremor. The earth seemed to be coming alive, responding to something, to some unseen force. The sky above him cracked open, sending a burst of light cascading down from the heavens. But it wasn't a gentle, warm light. It was harsh, glaring, and cold, like the first rays of the sun on an apocalyptic morning. Ben tried to stand, but the shaking intensified, forcing him to the ground again. His heart raced as he looked around, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. The earth was shifting, and he was trapped in the middle of it, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than he could comprehend. From the cracks in the ground, he could see it, something emerging from the depths, something so enormous and terrifying that it seemed to swallow the very light around it. The figure that rose from the chasm was unlike anything Ben had ever seen. It was vast, towering over him, its shape barely discernible in the chaos. Its body seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its skin flickering like flames licking the edges of the air. Its eyes, two glowing orbs of fiery red, were fixed directly on him, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Ben's breath caught in his throat. This is it, he thought. This is the end. The creature stepped forward, its massive form shaking the ground with each movement. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human, its features contorted in agony, as though it were both alive and dead. Its mouth opened wide, a cavern of darkness that seemed to stretch forever, and from it came a voice, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "You have seen the truth, boy. You have been shown the path, but you do not understand what it means." Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to back away, but his legs refused to move. His body was frozen in terror, unable to escape. The creature's presence was suffocating, its very being radiating an aura of despair and hopelessness. "You are the last one, the one who will bear the burden of truth," it continued, its voice a low growl that echoed through the air. "You have seen what they will become, but you will never be able to change their fate. They are already too far gone. You are too far gone." Ben's throat tightened, and for a moment he could hardly breathe. The words hit him like a blow, each one striking him harder than the last. Too far gone? Was this it? Was there no hope left for humanity? Could he really make them understand the gravity of what was coming, or was it all too late? "You will carry the message, but it will not be enough," the creature said, its eyes glowing brighter with every word. "It is already written. They have sealed their own fate." Ben could feel the weight of the creature's gaze like a physical force pressing down on him, suffocating him with its hopelessness. He wanted to speak, to argue, to deny what it was saying, but the words wouldn't come. He was powerless against it, trapped in this nightmare, unable to stop the unfolding disaster. But just as the creature loomed over him, preparing to deliver its final blow, something shifted. The air crackled with energy, and Ben felt a strange surge of power coursing through him, like a lightning bolt of understanding. There has to be a way, he thought, his mind racing. "I can't let this be the end. Not yet." The creature's eyes narrowed as if it sensed the shift in the air. "You think you can change fate?" it sneered, its voice dripping with derision. "You are nothing. You are just a boy. The world will end, and you will be powerless to stop it." Ben clenched his fists, the surge of energy inside him growing stronger, pushing back against the creature's influence. "I won't let it end this way," he whispered, his voice shaking but resolute. "I won't let the world fall without a fight." The creature's laughter echoed around him, a hollow, mocking sound that reverberated through the air. "Fighting won't change anything. It's too late." But Ben wasn't listening anymore. He could feel the truth deep within him, a fire igniting in his soul. The world was not beyond saving, and he wasn't going to let it be destroyed without a chance for redemption. He was the one who had been given this vision, this warning. And now, it was up to him to make the world listen. Ben could feel the fire burning inside him, a sense of urgency and purpose that surged with every beat of his heart. The creature before him was still laughing, its monstrous form towering over him, but the sound of its mockery no longer had the power to paralyze him. His mind, once clouded with doubt and confusion, was now sharp, focused on one thing: stopping the end. He couldn't wait. He couldn't be afraid. He had been given this vision for a reason, and there was still time. The creature's eyes flickered, noticing the change in Ben's demeanor, but it only sneered harder. "You really think you can stop it? You are nothing but a child. The world is already too far gone, too steeped in its own destruction. You cannot undo what has already been set in motion." Ben didn't flinch. He knew it was trying to break him, trying to make him doubt, but he wouldn't give in. "This isn't about me," he thought. "This is bigger than me." He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he refused to let it crush him. His eyes never left the creature's as he straightened, his posture no longer one of fear but of defiance. "You're wrong," he said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the oppressive air. "It's not too late. I won't let it be." The creature's laugh faltered for a moment, its dark eyes narrowing as if it had not expected this kind of resistance. "You cannot change the course of fate, boy. This world is already dying. Humanity has sealed its own fate with their greed, their arrogance, their ignorance. They will pay the price for it, and there is nothing you can do to stop that." But Ben didn't care about the creature's words. He wasn't here to debate it. He wasn't here to listen to the whispers of inevitability. He was here to act, to make the world understand, to take what he had been shown and turn it into a warning they couldn't ignore. "I don't know how to stop it," Ben whispered, more to himself than to the creature, "but I know I have to try." For a moment, everything was still. The creature stood motionless, its glowing eyes fixed on Ben with a mixture of amusement and disdain. But then, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled once more. The air grew thick, like the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. The walls of this strange, twisted world began to crumble, the ground splitting apart as if the very foundation of everything was cracking open. Ben staggered, his legs nearly giving way beneath him as the tremors rocked the earth. His vision blurred, but he held on, fighting to remain upright. He had to stay focused. He couldn't let the world fall apart. Not yet. The shadows around him swirled, taking shape once again, morphing into dark figures, humans, but twisted and distorted, their bodies broken and battered, their faces filled with sorrow and pain. They were the echoes of the lost souls, the ones who had already been consumed by their own actions, trapped in this purgatory. The figures moved slowly, dragging their feet through the cracked earth, their hollow eyes locked on Ben as if they were waiting for him to give them something, anything to give them meaning. "Look at them," the creature said, its voice now tinged with something colder, something deeper. "This is what humanity will become, these empty husks, wandering in the darkness, unable to find redemption. You cannot save them, Ben. You cannot save the world." But Ben wasn't listening. He refused to listen. He could feel the truth deep inside him, rising like a wave he couldn't stop. The darkness that surrounded him, the figures that haunted this forsaken land, they weren't the end. They were a warning, and Ben was the messenger. He could feel the weight of it, the responsibility to act, to bring this truth to those who could still change. There has to be a way, he thought again, desperate, his mind racing for the answers. His vision blurred once more, the world around him bending, stretching, and warping. The figures loomed closer, their faces now twisted in agony, their hands outstretched as if begging for release. They reached for Ben, their fingers long and skeletal, their touch cold and unfeeling. Each one of them was a victim of the world, of the choices made long before their time. "But I can't help them," he thought bitterly. "I can't fix this." He turned away from the figures, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the world he had once known was beyond saving. There was no undoing what had been done, no reversing the damage that had already been inflicted. But there was something else. He had seen the future, and he had been given a choice: to stand aside, to watch as everything crumbled, or to carry the warning to the living and give them a chance to change, to act before it was too late. The voice of the figure echoed again, louder now, almost drowning out everything else. "You are wasting your time. There is nothing you can do. They are too far gone, and you are just one boy. The world will burn, and there will be no one left to save it." Ben clenched his fists, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't stand here in the face of this nightmare and let it go unchecked. He had to do something. He had to try. "No," he whispered again, this time louder. "I won't give up. I won't let it happen." For the first time, the creature's expression seemed to shift. Its eyes flickered with something like uncertainty, or perhaps fear. But it quickly masked the emotion, its smug demeanor returning. "You cannot win, Ben," it said, its voice dripping with finality. "You are alone. You have no power here. Your time is running out." Ben took a step forward, his body trembling, but his resolve firm. "Then I'll show you," he said, his voice filled with a strength he hadn't known he had. "I'll show you that I'm not alone. And maybe, just maybe, if I can reach them, they'll listen. Maybe they'll change." The figure recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing. But before it could react further, the ground trembled again, the earth cracking open beneath Ben's feet. The landscape around him began to crumble even faster, pieces of the world falling away into the abyss. Ben closed his eyes, the reality of what he was facing sinking in. He had to go back. He had to take this vision, this warning, and make them listen. He couldn't let the world fall. He wouldn't let it, no matter what it cost him. Ben could feel the tension in the air crackling like electricity, a static hum vibrating through his body, pulling him toward a destiny he wasn't sure he was prepared for. The world around him was a chaotic whirlwind of destruction, pieces of reality breaking apart, falling away into the chasm that seemed to stretch to infinity. But Ben, standing at the center of it all, felt an overwhelming pull, a drive he couldn't ignore. This is the moment, he thought, his breath quickening. This is what I was chosen for. The weight of that thought crashed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. His hands clenched into fists, the truth of the vision now a solid, undeniable weight in his chest. He had been shown the future, a future of suffering, of pain, of humanity's inevitable downfall. And now, it was his responsibility to carry the message. As the ground continued to tremble beneath his feet, the figure loomed over him, watching with a mixture of indifference and malevolence. Its eyes, burning like twin coals, fixed on him, seemingly daring him to make his next move. The creature had said he was alone. It had said there was nothing he could do. But Ben knew better now. The power to change, to make them listen, was within him. With a surge of determination, Ben forced himself to move forward, stepping away from the abyss, from the collapsing world. He turned his gaze to the horizon, the land that stretched before him, an endless expanse of nothingness. It was a place that was once full of life, of possibility, now reduced to an empty void. He took another step, then another, the strength building with each movement. His breath steadied, the fear of failure dissolving in the face of his growing resolve. I have to act, he thought, I have to get to them. I have to make them see. The figure made no move to stop him, but it didn't need to. The world itself seemed to be pushing back, the very fabric of reality fighting to hold onto its last remnants of coherence. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as he approached the edge of the world. He knew what he had to do. The answer was as clear as it had ever been. He had to speak. He had to reach them. Suddenly, the air shifted, the temperature plummeting, as if the universe itself had been frozen in time. A sudden stillness washed over everything, like the world had held its breath, waiting. It was in this moment of perfect silence that the truth, the prophecy, seemed to come alive in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. The voices of the lost souls, the twisted figures that had wandered before him, rang in his ears once again, louder now. They whispered to him, filling his mind with the urgency of the warning he carried. Tell them, they implored. Tell them before it's too late. Ben's legs buckled beneath him, and he dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the intensity of what he was feeling. The weight of the future seemed to be pressing down on him, suffocating him. The knowledge of what would come if humanity didn't change, the suffering, the destruction, the endless pain, was too much to bear alone. But then, as he knelt on the cracked earth, the figure that had stood silent and imposing for so long finally spoke, its voice carrying a chilling edge. You still believe you can stop this? It asked, its voice dripping with venom, as though it found the very notion laughable. You think they will listen? You think they will change? It is too late for them, too late for this world. They are beyond saving. Ben's eyes burned with determination, the words of the creature no longer holding the weight they once did. They're not beyond saving. They just don't know what's coming. His voice trembled, but there was a fire in his words that he hadn't felt before. They have to listen. They have to understand. The figure's eyes narrowed, the dark glow intensifying. You're weak. You are nothing. You are a child playing at the role of a savior. Slowly, he stood up again, ignoring the overwhelming sense of dread that weighed him down. The vision, the warning, was clear in his mind. He wasn't alone. He had been chosen for this. He had to act. I may be a child, he said, his voice unwavering, but I am not alone. I won't be alone in this. They can still be saved. I will make them see. The figure before him moved again, but this time, its steps were slower, deliberate. It tilted its head as if considering his words. You cannot force them to listen, it said, its voice colder than ever. They will resist. They will fight. They will turn away, and in doing so, they will condemn themselves to the same fate you have seen. Ben's heart ached at the thought. He didn't want that. He didn't want to see the world end in pain and suffering. He wanted to show them, to make them understand before it was too late. I will make them understand, he said again, his voice stronger this time. I will make them see. It's not too late. The figure reached out again, its skeletal hand hovering just inches from Ben's face. But Ben didn't flinch. He didn't turn away. He faced it, his eyes burning with the fire of his resolve. "You will fail," the figure hissed. "They will never listen. And you will be left alone with the truth." But Ben shook his head, his chest heaving with the force of his emotions. "Then let me be the one who carries it. Let me be the one who tells them. They won't be alone. Not while I'm here." Ben's chest heaved, the weight of his newfound purpose pressing heavily on him. The darkness was closing in, but there was a strange sense of clarity now, a sharpness to his thoughts that hadn't been there before. He was standing at the edge of something terrible, and yet, something inside him still held on to hope. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite the creatures and the bleakness surrounding him, he knew that this wasn't the end. As the figure loomed before him, its skeletal hands still hovering close to his face, Ben stood firm. The creature had warned him that humanity would resist, that the truth would fall on deaf ears, and that in the end he would be left alone, carrying a burden that no one would ever understand. But Ben didn't care about its threats. He didn't care about the mockery in its voice. "You still don't understand," the creature hissed, its breath cold against his skin. "This world is already lost. The truth you carry is a curse, not a blessing. They will turn away from you, just as they turned away from everything that could have saved them. There is no saving them now." Ben's heart ached at the thought. It was hard to fathom that the world he had once known was teetering on the brink of collapse, that humanity had brought itself to this point. But deep inside him, he knew that he couldn't let that be the final answer. He couldn't accept the world's fate as sealed. He couldn't let it end in this endless cycle of suffering and death. "I won't let it be the end," Ben said, his voice breaking through the cold, oppressive air. "I'll make them see. I'll make them understand the truth. I won't stop." The figure before him laughed, a hollow, eerie sound that echoed through the void. It wasn't the kind of laughter that invited joy, it was the laughter of something ancient and malevolent, a mockery of everything Ben had come to know about life. The figure took another step closer, its skeletal frame towering over him, its eyes glowing brighter. "You're a fool," it spat, its voice filled with contempt. "Do you think they will listen to a boy who has been brought back from the dead? Do you think they will hear your warning? No one cares about the truth anymore. All they care about is their own selfish desires. You are nothing to them. And you will die with that knowledge." Ben felt the words strike him like daggers. They were harsh and painful, but they didn't break him. No, if anything, they fueled the fire inside him. He had been given this truth for a reason. He had been shown the future, the devastation that would unfold if humanity didn't wake up, and no matter how hard the figure tried to convince him otherwise, he knew what he had to do. He took a deep breath, his body shaking as he stepped forward, past the creature, beyond its suffocating presence. The world around him seemed to warp again, the ground beneath him shifting like sand. The air thickened as the shadows stretched and coiled around him. He wasn't sure where he was going, but the pull, the purpose, was undeniable. And then he heard it. A voice, distant at first, but growing louder. It was the voice of the lost souls, the ones he had seen wandering aimlessly, trapped in this desolate place. Their voices rose in unison, each one carrying a message, a plea for help. "Tell them," they cried, their voices desperate. "Tell them what they have done. Tell them what will happen if they don't listen. The end is coming." Ben's heart pounded as the words of the lost souls filled his mind. He couldn't turn away. He couldn't ignore them. Their pain, their suffering, it was all a reflection of humanity's blind greed, their refusal to acknowledge the consequences of their actions. It was a reflection of everything he had seen, everything he had felt since he had been brought back. The figure, still watching from the distance, sneered. "You will fail," it said coldly. "You will fail and the world will crumble. Nothing can change what's coming. You will walk away, just like the rest of them, and nothing will be different." Ben paused, his breath catching in his throat as the weight of the figure's words pressed down on him. Maybe it's right, he thought for a moment. Maybe it's too late. Maybe I can't change anything. But then he remembered what had brought him here. He had been shown this future for a reason. He had been chosen to carry the message, to warn the living, to make them see the truth. If he gave up now, if he accepted defeat, the world would truly be lost. No, Ben whispered fiercely to himself, shaking his head. I won't stop. I can't. With those words, the ground beneath him trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the earth shaking. It was the very foundation of the world itself, as if everything was being torn apart at its core. The light in the distance began to flicker, dimming, then flaring back up in a sudden burst. Ben could feel the force of the energy building inside him, pushing him forward. You are nothing, the figure repeated, its voice growing more frantic. You will not change anything. The end is inevitable. But Ben didn't listen. He couldn't. He refused to let it end like this. There was still a chance, no matter how small, that the truth he carried could change the world. And he was going to fight for that chance. The figure's laugh rang out once more, but this time it sounded hollow, less certain, as if even it could feel the shift in the air. Ben's heart raced as he felt something change in the atmosphere, like a door was slowly opening, a path forward, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. You won't be able to save them, the figure hissed one final time. They will destroy themselves, and you will be left alone to witness it. But Ben no longer heard the creature's words. He had already made up his mind. He was ready to face the world, ready to carry the burden of truth, even if it meant walking alone. Because this wasn't just his fight, it was humanity's last chance. The air around him seemed to shift once more, the weight of the universe pressing down on him with every passing second. Ben was no longer just a boy caught in a vision. He was something else now, something stronger. He was a messenger, and he would make the world listen.